Salut, soyez bienvenue. Welcome to another video with me. We're going to talk about ER verbs, but again, as always, you can stop, pause the video, change the setting at the bottom to speed up or slow down, and be sure to take those notes because this is your video now. Ok, soyez bienvenue. ER verbs are ici, ils sont faciles. We're going to cover a lot of information. What is a verb in the first place? What's an infinitive? What does conjugate mean? Should I conjugate both verbs if I have two verbs in a sentence? And how are they easy? And then, of course, which verbs are you most likely to be tested on if you're a French 1 student? How do you say don't? And what if I want to tell somebody what to do? And then even if you want to stay along for the end, we're also going to cover more verbs that you might want to use if you're a student like I am who wants to know more. So, qu'est-ce que c'est un verbe? What is a verb? It's a word of action, occurrence, a state of being. So, toutes les phrases ont besoin d'un verbe conjugué. Every sentence needs a conjugated verb, and oftentimes sentences are in a structure of subject, then verb, and then object. So, example, words of action are like danse, devient, becoming, some, being. Those are all verbs, even though they're not all actions precisely, in the sense that they can become or be. And then every sentence needs a conjugated verb. So I like to eat chocolate. And here we have two verbs. We have a helping verb and an infinitive verb, one that is not conjugated. So let's talk about the verbs that we already know, être and avoir. And we've already seen je suis, tu es, il est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils sont, or j'ai, tu as, il a, nous avons, vous avez, il est, elle, ont. We've already seen those, but let's look at some of the things that they have in common with ER verbs that make ER verbs easy. For example, tu es, as I mentioned before, it ends in an S, just like tu as ends in an S, and you'll see that pattern with tu forms with our être verbs. Other things that are similar are the new form, ONS. That we're going to see with all of our ER verbs, even though some doesn't have it. Let's take a look at another similarity. Vous avez ends in EZ, and this is why ER verbs are easier, because the vous form ends in EZ. So super facile. And lastly, they form. Although irregular verbs end in ONT, in these four most used French verbs that we talk about, like être, avoir, aller, and faire, ER verbs are just going to end in ENT. So one slightly. Commonly in French 1, we have a list of ER verbs that we first learn. So let's take a look at how to pronounce them and then how to use them. Example, aimer. Notice ER at the end is going to have that A sound on all of these. Arriver, déjeuner, dîner, écouter, habiter. Notice the H isn't pronounced. Inviter, that N becomes nasal. So inviter, jouer. We use jouer au for playing sports, but jouer de when we talk about instruments, which is why those two are there. Parler, préparer, regarder, rester, réviser, téléphoner, and travailler, which means to work. But okay, so when we have two verbs and the same sentences we saw before, for example, tu aimes manger le chocolat, the first one is going to be conjugated, unless it's connected with like and or but. The first one's the one conjugated. And then the second one is an infinitive, because obviously that first one is a helping verb. So that will only happen with verbs like to like, to hate, to prefer, to wish, to want. Because if we conjugate both of them, we wind up with a sentence like tu aimes manger le chocolat. I like eat the chocolate. Where we want I like to eat the chocolate. Notice when we conjugate any verb in the present tense, like am, it can mean three different things, although we will normally translate it in one way, whichever way sounds best to us, because am conjugated means like, are liking, and do like. Okay, so let's see some conjugation charts. When we take off, to conjugate, we take off the ER and we add these endings to all of those lists of verbs. So, c'est super facile. Donc, It's easy. So we take off the R, we add es, as I mentioned before, which is the same as the je form, so super facile. Ons, which is just like the verb avoir, avons, avait, like easy at the end of avait, and ent instead of ont. And the cool thing about this is that all of these will sound the same. Je parle, tu parles, il parle, and il parle. Which makes speaking French sometimes a lot easier than speaking other languages. It's the same thing with all the verbs. So we take off the ER and we add the same endings, and they will all sound the same in the boot. Same thing with dîne. Again, we add our endings, es, ons, ez, ent, and din, 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 din. So conjugation, again, if you want to say, I like to eat at restaurants, there's steps. First, you choose the verb, that's the action. You're liking, so am. You take off the ER, you add, you choose your subject, and you choose the correct ending, j'aime, and then the rest of your sentence. Notice that second verb is not conjugated. And you can use all of these verbs in the same way. However, at the end, I will talk about all of these verbs. It's 194 high-frequency verbs that you will see the most often used in French. And if you're like me, you want to know those. And on those, there are a few that have a slightly different conjugation. Here, like ouvrir will look like an ER verb. Appeler will have two L's in the boot. Ennuyer, the Y turns to an I inside the boot. And jeter, we have two T's. But that's for later. So again, we have one petite chose à vous dire. When we have verbs like manger, voyager, partager, they end in a G in their root. So when we take off the ER, we have a G sound. So what happens in the new form, because the G is followed by an O, it becomes a G sound. Mangon and camencon, and we don't want that. So we follow French grammatical rules to avoid that. So in the new form, we'll add an E, and in the new form, we'll add a cedilla, that squiggly line under the C, to avoid that. Lastly, we just need to talk about imperatives, which are commands, and negatives, which are also pretty facile. So here's some regular sentences like t'es gentil, tu as un biscuit. And to turn them into imperatives, all we have to do is take off the subject for either tu, vous, or nous, because we can only command you or us, and we're done, pretty much, unless you have an irregular verb like être, to be, or avoir. So be nice, sois gentil, aille un biscuit. But otherwise, notice I would normally be vous aimez le fromage, you like cheese, but here it says like cheese. You don't need you. Let's walk to the central commercial. Instead of nous marchons, we walk, it's let's walk, marchons. Okay, except for in the you form, you don't need an S for ER verbs. That's all. So it's not invite with an S or téléphone with an S. We take those S's off. Negatives are also facile. Negative just means we put no in front of the verb and pas after the verb, and we sandwich that verb. So, tu n'es pas gentil, tu n'as pas d'un biscuit. C'est super, super facile. So let's review. Any verb that we conjugate means three things. So if I say le garçon marche, the boy walks, he does walk, he is walking. Il étudie le droit, they study law, they do study law, they are studying law. And these are very interesting then, because when we're asking a question, in English we normally say, do you like cheese? We don't need the do. We just, because it's included in the sense of the verb that we don't normally translate when we're translating from French to English. So if I want to say, hey, do they study law? All I have to do is say, il étudie le droit. C'est super facile. And then again, what else did we learn? We learned that stems that end in G or C will need a little something extra in order to keep the sound. And that there are this many different verbs from our book. We conjugate using es, ons, ez, ent as our endings. All we have to do is take off the ER. We only conjugate the first verb unless it's connected by and or but. We just put ne and pas around the verb and sandwich it, and we have negation. It means the not. To create a command, we just drop the subject, and then in the to form, we drop the S as well. So that's what we learned about ER verbs are easy. If you want to learn about a couple more verbs that are high frequency, stay tuned and I'll pronounce them for you. Okay, high frequency verbs are things like abandonner, acheter, accompagner, acheter, adorer, aider, amener, amuser, appeler. And notice how there's some different colors here. So acheter and no is going to be used for sure. And at some point in French 101 and 102, you'll probably see these other ones. So maybe I should just go with the light colored. So appeler, arrêter, blesser, which is to get hurt. I know it sounds like to bless, but bouger, very common, to move, cacher, to hide, calmer. Chanter, commencer, continuer, coucher, couper, coûter, créer, crier, danser, décider, demander, désoler, détester, deviner, deviner, dîner, discuter. You can't see, oops, but donner is to give, douter is to doubt, échapper, écouter, embrasser, entrer, envoyer, épouser, espérer, essayer, étudier, excuser, expliquer, fermer. Frapper, fumer, gagner, garder, habiter, imaginer. You can't see, but intéresser, investir, jeter, jouer, laisser, laver, lever, manger. Monkey, which is really interesting. Monkey has an M in front. I know you can't see that. It's used differently. So if you ever get a chance to look at that, it's super intéressant. Marcher, marier, mériter, monter, montrer, oublier. Parler, partager, passer, payer. And notice how in the parentheses I'm giving you a little bit more information, how the Y changes into an I outside of the boot. Penser, pleurer, porter, poser, pousser, préférer, préparer et présenter. Quitter, raconter, rappeler, rater. Regarder, regretter, rencontrer, rentrer, répéter, réparer. Respirer, rester, retourner, retrouver, which is really interesting because, trouver is to find, retrouver, to meet up. Réveiller, rêver, sauter, sauver. Signifier, sonner, souhaiter. Like if you're saying bless you, you say à tes souhaits, which is from this. Terminer, tomber, toucher, tourner. Traîner is can be to hang out with somebody, so I really like that one. Travailler, again, most people consider this one like they think it's to travel, but it's to work. Tromper, to make a mistake. Trouver, to find. You can see, but utiliser. Vérifier, and voler. Again, that's 194 verbs that are high frequency, and you're going to see them all. I'll try to post a list of those in like a link, if I can link up something to help you. And comme toujours, si vous avez des questions, laisse-moi savoir. À bientôt.